Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to read a histogram, which is very important because a histogram is a graphical representation of the tonal values of your image. So how bright is your image? How dark is it? You can understand that just by taking a look at your histogram. How cool is that? So I've started this off with this image right here. On the top right hand side we can see that this is a histogram. Okay, so how do you read this? It's actually pretty simple. If you look at this graph, right, at the very right, at the very corner, it is the whites. So basically in an image we have shadows, midtones and highlights. Okay, so highlights are the brightest parts of your frame. So what are whites? Whites are the brightest of the highlights, which basically is completely white. There are no details, and we call that a washed out image, right? So when it's washed out, you get the value on white. And then we have the highlights, and then we have the midtones, which is the center of the histogram. Okay, the center of the histogram is the midtones, which are the areas of your image that are not too bright or too dark. It's basically neutral tones. And then we have the shadows, and what the shadows are is they are the dark sections of your image. So sections like this, for example, where it's super dark but it's not completely black, that would be considered a shadow. You know how I said whites are the brightest parts of the highlights? Well, blacks are the darkest parts of the shadows, and you can see that at the very edge of the histogram. So we have blacks, we have shadows, we have midtones, we have highlights, and then we have whites. So if you look at this image, we can see that the graph is kind of balanced. We have sections that are in the highlights, the shadows and the midtones. They are clipping. So if we on the clipping, we can see that all of this are the whites. And if we on the clipping in the black, we can see that this is the black, right? So there are no details over here where the blue is being clipped. And if I turn on the clipping for the whites, we can see that there are no details in any of this. That's why it's all white. So just by looking at this graph, I can kind of tell, okay, there's a lot of whites with no detail. There are some highlights, there's a little bit of midtones, there's quite a lot of shadows, and there are quite a lot of like dark sections of the frame just by looking at the histogram. So look at what happens when I bring down the exposure. So I'm going to bring down the exposure of the image, and as we bring down the exposure, we can see that the blacks are becoming like clipped, right? That is because as we bring down the exposure, the graph moves from the shadows into the black, so more of the shadows turn black, and we can see as we move the slider, the more clipping takes place in the black sections of the frame. So if we bring down the shadows, we darken the shadows, if we make the image more contrasty, we can see how the shadows and the highlights along with the graph just moves according to what change we do. And that is important to note when making edits, is that we can look at the graph and we can make our edits accordingly. Okay, so as you can see, I've just pulled up a white image, and if you look at the histogram, you can see that the reading is on the complete right because there is only white in this frame. That's why it's only white on the histogram. So if we take a completely black image, we can see that it just switches from the right to the left. Now there's only black, and just by looking at the histogram and seeing that there's only values on the very left, which is the blacks, we can just tell that this is a black image. If you look at this, we take a gray, and this is 50% gray, which is a neutral color. So if you look at 50% gray, we can see that the value on the histogram, the reading is right in the center. That's because it is a mid-tone color, it is a neutral color, so it is right in the center. So when we go white, it goes all the way to the right, rhyming. When we go black, it goes all the way to the left. And then when we take a neutral color, which is a mid-tone like gray, it goes all the way in the center. Now what happens when we take out a grayscale? So this is a grayscale, right? So it has values from black all the way to white. So we can look at how each color basically has its own section in the histogram. It's because they are all of different values. So just by looking at how the graph is on the histogram, we can kind of know if the image is dark or if the image is bright or if it has a lot of midtones, if it's highlight heavy or shadow heavy. So let's look at some example images that I have over here. This is of this building in Toronto. If you look at this, there's a lot of highlights. It's highlight heavy. So there is a lot of clipping that's taking place. So the entire background is white, and that's what we see on this side of the histogram. We have highlights, which are all the bright sections. We have midtones, which are all the neutral sections like this. And then we have some shadows as well. And if you go here, you can see that all of like this section is in the shadows, right? So we have highlights, midtones, and shadows, and we don't have any blacks clipping it, right? But if I bring down the exposure, slowly we can see that the clipping starts to take place in the shadows. So, and we can see in the graph that the entire graph has moved towards the shadow side. So we bring it back to neutral, the graph is neutral, and then if we overexpose the image, we can see that now the graphs have moved more towards the highlight side, and there's more white clipping that takes place. Crazy, right? Look at this image. This is a dark image, right? So unlike that, this, we can see that the graph is more leaning towards the shadow side, and there's shadow clipping that's taking place. That means there's a lot of black in the frame. Look at the way the graph changes. How crazy is that? We can just look at the graph and we can tell whether the image is dark or bright or neutral, or it's completely washed out white or washed out black. Knowing this is so helpful as a photographer. You guys, like, I'll tell you a situation that I found myself in. So something happened to my camera, and I couldn't use the display anymore, and I couldn't play back the images. So there was no way for me to find out whether my images were overexposed or underexposed, and the only way I could tell is by looking at the histogram. Was the histogram leaning more towards the right, or was it leaning more towards the left, or was it neutral? And just by studying the histogram, I was able to perfectly expose all my images. Like, how cool is that? Knowing how to read a histogram, it is very helpful for you as a photographer and you as a creative. So keep that in mind, and put your images onto Lightroom. Look at how the histogram works. Your camera might have a histogram option. You can enable that, and as you change the exposure values, you can look at whether your image is going to be underexposed or overexposed or perfectly exposed just by looking at the position of the histogram, which is pretty cool. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Also, I'm wearing a squid hat. How cool is that? Look at its eyes. It's little like blobs. I'm a squid. I'll see you guys in the next video.